It's November 24th, 2020, and it has been a few weeks since Joe Biden finally got elected as the 46th President of the United States. Election day took place on November 3rd of this year, of this month actually, but the election wasn't actually decided until November 7th. It was decided on that day that Joe Biden would actually be the winner of this election when it was projected that he would win the state of Pennsylvania. So it was declared that Joe Biden would win on November 7th, and since then, there's been a lot of discussion surrounding who is he going to choose for all of his different cabinet picks. Because when you're the president, you don't just have the vice president, but you also have a whole bunch of cabinet members that help you out when making decisions. And he has to appoint cabinet members. He has to appoint members to fill his cabinet. And then once he appoints those members have to be approved by the Senate. So there's been a lot of discussion surrounding his cabinet choices, and one of the reasons why there's been a lot of discussions surrounding his cabinet picks is because of the fact that Joe Biden has to try to appeal to as many people as possible because Joe Biden's base is made up of people that are centrists, moderates, or center left people, as well as people that are further left wing, such as the type of people who would support Bernie Sanders. So he is going to have to try to appeal to the centrists, the moderates, as well as the liberals, the progressives, the further left people. And in doing so, he has to try to choose people for his cabinet that are both moderate. Some people will have to be more moderate, and then some people also have to be more progressive. So Joe Biden has to try to appeal to as many different sections of his support base as he possibly can, because Joe Biden has some supporters that are more moderate that supported him during the primaries, while some of his supporters supported Bernie Sanders or maybe even Elizabeth Warren in the primaries. But then after they lost, they put their support behind Joe Biden because they thought he was better than Donald Trump. And I'm making this video because I want to talk about the split, the division within the Democrats that has been there for quite a while. I made a video a few days ago or even a week or two ago talking about the division that was emerging among the Republicans, where I talked about the difference between the further right people that were pretty diehard Trump supporters and then the center right people, the more moderate Republicans. And I brought that topic up. I made a video surrounding that topic because of the fact that a lot of Trump supporters, a lot of people who previously were fans of Fox News, who previously really enjoyed watching Fox News, they were now turning their back against Fox News. They were now opposed to that news network because of the fact that they called, for some of the people, it was because of the fact that they declared Joe Biden the president-elect of the United States. And a lot of people were not happy with that because they felt like Trump should have won that election, or that they were calling it too early and that they should wait until all the lawsuits passed through before calling it for Joe Biden. So there was a split. There still is the split emerging within the Republican Party between center right people, more moderate Republicans, and further right people, more conservative Republicans. And similar to how there is a division emerging on the Republican side, it has already been there, but it has sort of intensified in recent weeks following Joe Biden's declaration of victory. There's also a division emerging among the Democrats, and it was more obvious during the primaries earlier this year, the Democratic primaries, but it was not as clear during the presidential election season. But now we might start to see that division become more obvious again, more clear again. Now, during the primaries, there were many, many different candidates running. I believe that there's been more major candidates running in this year's presidential primaries for the Democrats than any other presidential election cycle in history. I know in 2016 there were around 17 candidates running for the Republican nomination, and Donald Trump ended up winning out of all those people, as we know. But this year, for the Democratic primaries, there was even more than that. I believe the number was almost 30, it was maybe 29 ish. I don't remember the exact number. It was definitely over 20 though. And and in the first couple debates, they had way too many candidates to just do in one session, in one night. So they had to split the debate up into two separate nights, into two separate sessions, where one of the debates would have 10 candidates, and then another day, the day after, they would have 10 more candidates. So on day one, there would be 10 candidates. On day two, there would be 10 more candidates because they couldn't fit 20 candidates onto a single stage, into a single night. And even then, even when they did 20 whole candidates in a debate split among two different debates, two separate sessions, split between two different days, there were still people who were left out because they only allowed 20 candidates to participate in the debate in total because there were just too many candidates where they had to leave some out, even when they allowed two separate debates to take place, two separate nights for the debate to happen. There were more than 20 candidates in total, so they had to make the cutoff at 20 candidates. So there were two or three candidates in each debate, because there were two debates where they had to split the debate among 2 different days. One of them was in June, one of them was in July of last year. But for both of those debates, they had to make the cutoff 20 candidates because there were 23 candidates in total, so two or three candidates for each of those debates had to be let out, had to be shut out. And that just shows how diverse ideologically and in terms of background each of the candidates were in the 2020 Democratic primaries. But despite the fact that there were that many candidates, most of them did not fare so well in the primaries. A lot of them dropped out before they even had a chance to compete in the primaries. One of the most notable examples of that was Kamala Harris, who is now the vice president of the United States, or technically she's not the vice president yet, but in around 2 months she will be the vice president of the United States. So many candidates didn't poll better than like 2% in the polls, so they dropped out before the primaries even began. But there were several candidates that still had a decent chance of winning. These included Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren. They were the four main candidates, and then Bloomberg. He entered the primaries late, but he was like the fifth major candidate. And then besides that, there were a few minor candidates that still got a few percentage points in the primaries, such as Amy Klobuchar, Andrew Yang, and Tulsi Gabbard, who was doing pretty badly in the primaries, but still was the third to last person to drop out, or second to last person to drop out actually, because Joe Biden didn't really drop out. But when she dropped out, it was only Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden left in the primaries. So, from the start, Joe Biden was always polling in first place for the most part. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were battling out for second place, and then Pete Buttigieg. Pete Buttigieg was usually polling in fourth place, but then once Michael Bloomberg joined the race, he kind of shook things up a bit because at one point he was in fifth place, then at one point he was in fourth place, and then even third or second place at one point. But regardless, Pete Buttigieg dropped out right before Super Tuesday, so did most other candidates. And then Elizabeth Warren dropped out right after Super Tuesday, and so did Michael Bloomberg. So at that point, it was just Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, the two major candidates in the race, and for some reason Tulsi Gabbard was still in the race, but she obviously had no chance of winning. So even though there were almost 30 candidates in total, eventually the field narrowed down to just Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. And out of those two candidates, Joe Biden ended up winning the primaries, as we know now, because he's going to be the president of the United States. So it was Joe Biden who represented the more moderate people in the Democratic base, while Bernie Sanders represented the more progressive branch of the Democratic Party. So during most of the primary season, Joe Biden was polling in first place and Bernie Sanders was polling in second place. And at one point, Elizabeth Warren was beating both of those candidates, and then at one point, Michael Bloomberg came along and beat both of those candidates for a brief moment. Or he was at least getting second place in some of the polls. There were a few polls where he actually won, but by the time South Carolina came along, by the time Joe Biden won the South Carolina primary, Michael Bloomberg's poll numbers started to drop quite a bit because a lot of the people who previously supported Bloomberg then started supporting Biden. And here's why Joe Biden ultimately won the primaries and not Bernie Sanders. It is mainly because of the fact that right before Super Tuesday, the day before that, both Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, who had dropped out right before, Pete Buttigieg dropped out on March 1st, Amy Klobuchar dropped out on March 2nd, and that March 2nd, that night itself, Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar both endorsed Joe Biden because Super Tuesday was March 3rd, the day after that, so Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar started backing Joe Biden just in time for Super Tuesday. So a lot of the people that previously supported those two candidates, they overwhelmingly started voting for Joe Biden. If neither of those candidates had endorsed Joe Biden, it is possible that more of their supporters would have started supporting Bernie Sanders after they dropped out, but because they both explicitly endorsed Joe Biden, that is probably why most of their supporters voted for Joe Biden. And because Joe Biden plus Pete Buttigieg plus Amy Klobuchar in total had a larger base than Bernie Sanders did, more people supported either Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar in total than did support Bernie Sanders. The votes for Joe Biden eventually overwhelmed the votes for Bernie Sanders, and then Joe Biden was able to win the primaries. And then around a month later in early April, Bernie Sanders dropped out of the primaries because none of the primaries were even taking place for the most part. I believe that the Wisconsin primary took place in early April, but most of the primaries got delayed because of the pandemic, which actually began screwing over the United States right after Super Tuesday. Like a week after that is when all the restrictions started being put in place. And I guess that's the main reason why Bernie Sanders dropped out so early on, because in 2016, Bernie Sanders took it all the way to the convention. He dropped out pretty late, but this year, he dropped out pretty early on because of the pandemic and the fact that all these primaries got delayed. And it was pretty obvious by then that Joe Biden was going to win the nomination because of the fact that many other candidates who were previously in the primaries but dropped out started supporting Joe Biden. So, Bernie Sanders represented the more progressive wing of the party, Joe Biden represented the more moderate wing of the party, and ultimately the more moderate wing of the party won out, and that is because of the fact that Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, who I would say were between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders ideologically, Joe Biden was more moderate, Bernie Sanders was more progressive, but Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, I'd say, were in between that. At least Pete Buttigieg was. Amy Klobuchar was closer to the Joe Biden type of Democrat, but Joe Biden won, the moderate wing ended up winning. And one of the reasons why that could have also been is because of the fact that Elizabeth Warren did not drop out until after Super Tuesday. So a lot of people that could have voted for Bernie Sanders had she dropped out instead of voted for Elizabeth Warren. So it's possible that the progressives votes got split between those two candidates because Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were the main progressive candidates while Joe Biden was the main moderate candidate. So why does this matter? This matters because this division has not gone away. It might seem like it settled down a bit in the past few months, but that's just because of the fact that it was Joe Biden who is a moderate Democrat versus Donald Trump, who is a further right Republican, who's a more conservative Republican. At least compared to previous Republican presidents, Donald Trump is definitely more conservative in comparison. So, for a lot of people who supported Bernie Sanders, the choice was pretty obvious. Do you support the moderate Democrat or the further right conservative Republican? And for most of these people, the choice was obvious. They supported Joe Biden in the general election. And a lot of people were not really happy to do so. They feel like Bernie Sanders should have been the nominee, but the Bernie Sanders supporters eventually sucked it up and, for the most part, voted for Joe Biden in the general election. There are some people who didn't vote for either of the candidates or voted for a third party candidate because they were mad about Joe Biden. They thought that his policy positions were too distinct from Bernie Sanders' policy positions. They thought that Joe Biden wouldn't adequately represent their views, and they decided that they either would not vote or they would vote for a third party candidate. But for the most part, most of the people that supported Bernie Sanders in the primaries eventually put their support around Joe Biden in the general election because they thought that Joe Biden more closely aligned with their beliefs and they thought a moderate Democrat was better than a conservative Republican. But now that the election's over, now that Joe Biden's won, it's possible that a lot of these people are going to not be too happy with some of Joe Biden's policy plans because of the fact that his policy plans are ones that more moderate Democrats would support, center-left people will support, but people who are more progressive may not be too happy about them. So a lot of people may not be too happy with Joe Biden's presidency as a whole, who supported Bernie Sanders in the primaries. So that might be an issue in the coming years in the Biden administration, but at the same time, you also have a division emerging among the Republicans, so both political parties have infighting taking place. I personally think that it'll be pretty interesting to see what effect this has on the 2024 primaries after Joe Biden is president for 4 years, and if he decides to retire, which is unclear at this moment. He may choose to retire, he may choose to go another term, he may choose to run in the 2024 election. It's not clear at this point because he will be 82 years old in 2024. He may feel like he's too old to handle the job properly, and he may want someone younger to do the job instead. So if Joe Biden decides not to run a second term, Kamala Harris would be the most likely candidate to become the nominee 4 years from now because she was the vice president, or she will be the vice president for Joe Biden. So because of that, she will have a lot of name recognition, kind of like how Joe Biden was the most likely to win the primaries in this election cycle because he was the vice president for Obama. He had a lot of name recognition, and that's why he got a lot of votes in the primaries. And that's why he eventually became the Democratic nominee. But it'll be interesting to see how this division within the Democratic Party plays through in 4 years from now in the 2024 primaries if Joe Biden decides not to run for president then.